Hi, I'm Brianna. I'm 17, and for as long as I can remember, my mom has been the person I trusted most, until one day that trust shattered in a way I never expected. She always told me we couldn't afford the things other families took for granted. Vacations, school trips, little weekend getaways, they were always too expensive or not in the budget. I believed her. I really did, until I saw something that made me question everything. Before I get into that, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. And if you like real family stories full of twists and life lessons, don't forget to subscribe for more stories about trust, betrayal, and the courage to face reality. I remember the conversation like it happened yesterday. My mom sat at the kitchen table, her face tight, eyes flicking toward the bills scattered across the surface. "Brianna," she said, her voice low but firm, "we just can't afford a vacation this year. We're broke. You know how tight things are." She glanced at my stepdad, who nodded without saying a word. I forced a smile, trying to hide the disappointment clawing at my chest. I had been dreaming about this vacation for months. Even just imagining it made my stomach flutter with excitement. The sun on my face, walking down streets in a city I'd only seen in movies, taking pictures, laughing. But every time I brought it up, my mom would give the same answer. "We can't. We're broke." At first, I understood. Money is tight, I thought. I convinced myself that sacrifices are part of being a family. The next day, my best friend Maya came to school with pictures from her family trip to the coast. She was glowing, showing off snapshots of sandy beaches, boardwalks, and ice cream cones. I smiled at her pictures, but inside, I felt a quiet sting. I didn't complain. I didn't say a word. I didn't want to seem ungrateful for what we had. But deep down, a small voice whispered, "Why not me?" At home, the details started to bother me. My stepdad brought home a new jacket one weekend, expensive leather that I had noticed when he unwrapped it. A few nights later, my mom mentioned wanting to go out for dinner. And they did, just the two of them. I stayed in my room, scrolling through my phone, pretending to study, but my mind was elsewhere. I wondered why these small pleasures existed for them, while I was told our budget was too tight. One afternoon, I overheard a whispered conversation between my parents in the living room. I wasn't trying to listen, it just happened. My mom said something about saving for something special, her voice barely above a whisper. My stepdad agreed, quietly. I froze at the doorway. Something in that phrase made my stomach twist. Something special wasn't meant for me. I realized the truth, or at least a version of it, was there, hidden behind words that sounded innocent. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe they were talking about a family emergency or bills we didn't know about. I wanted to believe the best, because believing otherwise hurt too much. But that tiny knot in my chest refused to dissolve. It stayed there, tightening every time I thought about the trips I'd missed, the school events I never got to attend, the little joys my friends took for granted. On Fridays, my mom and stepdad would sometimes go out to a movie or dinner. I would stay behind, pretending to be okay with it, telling myself it was just a normal routine. But one Friday night, curiosity got the better of me. I peeked into their bedroom. They weren't planning anything mundane. There were brochures spread across the bed, pictures of destinations I could only dream about, all neatly organized, all labeled with flight costs and hotel rates. I swallowed hard, backing away before they noticed me. My heart pounded. They were planning something I wasn't a part of. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table alone, a notebook in front of me. I started jotting down every time I've been told we can't afford it versus the small, unexplained expenditures I'd noticed over the months. I didn't know why I was writing it down, only that I needed to make sense of it. My hand shook as I wrote. Each line felt heavier than the last. I realized this wasn't just about money, it was about trust. A week later, I tried asking gently, hoping for some reassurance or explanation. "Mom," I said one evening while she was cooking, "I noticed you and Dad went out the other night. What was that for?" She glanced at me quickly, frowning. "It was nothing for you to worry about," she replied, a little sharper than she intended. I felt my chest tighten. I nodded silently, pretending to understand, but the quiet suspicion in my mind refused to go away. Days blurred into weeks. I noticed small things that didn't fit the story I'd been told about our broke family. A new book my stepdad bought, a coffee machine my mom insisted was on sale, random online orders arriving at the door with no explanation. I started paying closer attention, cataloging them quietly in my notebook. Each item, each small indulgence, felt like another confirmation that our budget wasn't the whole truth. School was no escape. Friends would casually mention their upcoming family trips, and I'd nod along, hiding my envy behind smiles. I felt a strange mix of shame and anger, shame for wanting what they had, and anger at the fact that I had been led to believe I couldn't have the same experiences. I began daydreaming in class, imagining myself walking along the streets of cities far away, imagining the life I was being denied. One afternoon, while my mom was on a phone call in the living room, I overheard her laughter. She said something about getting a first-class experience for both of them. My heart stopped. First class? The words echoed in my head. It didn't make sense. I had been told we were broke. We couldn't go on trips. But now, here it was, proof whispered carelessly that we weren't living in financial struggle at all. I felt betrayed, but also confused. My mom was my safe place, my confidant for years. How could someone I trusted completely tell me we were broke, while secretly planning luxuries I couldn't even imagine? I tried to push the thought away, telling myself I didn't understand the whole story. But deep down I knew the truth. Something had been hidden from me my entire life. That night, I stayed awake long after the lights went out. I thought about every birthday that was skipped, every school trip I missed, every time I was told, we just can't afford it. Memories I had long forgotten resurfaced with sharp clarity. The whispered words, the new purchases, the private plans, they all pointed to a reality I hadn't wanted to see. I had been excluded intentionally. In the days that followed, I started noticing even more. My stepdad had a new watch that I'd never seen him wear before. My mom mentioned a dinner with a friend that cost more than we usually spent on groceries for a week. Every small detail, every seemingly insignificant purchase, was a crack in the story I had believed my entire life. I began questioning everything. Had she ever told me the truth about money, or was it always a tool to control me, to make me feel like I had to accept less so I wouldn't complain? The anger and disappointment grew quietly inside me, a slow burn that I couldn't extinguish. One Saturday, I decided to confront the reality of my situation by looking into the details myself. I found old receipts tucked away in drawers, credit card statements she had left on the counter. Each one was a revelation, a small, undeniable proof that our financial struggles had been exaggerated, or at least selectively presented. My hands shook as I held the papers. It was proof not of poverty, but of intentional exclusion. I didn't confront her immediately. I wasn't ready. Instead, I retreated into my room and wrote everything down. The lies, the missed opportunities, the feelings of inadequacy I had swallowed. My notebook became a sanctuary, a place where I could express emotions I had never voiced aloud. Each page was a mix of sorrow, disbelief, and the first sparks of determination. That week, I tried to act normal, laughing at jokes, helping with chores, pretending nothing had changed. But inside, I was simmering. Every small act of kindness she offered felt like a reminder of the gap between us, the trust that had been broken and the moments she had stolen from me without realizing it. I kept observing, documenting, and reflecting. The longer I watched, the more patterns I noticed. It wasn't just one isolated incident. It was consistent. Every time I wanted to participate in something meaningful, the answer was always no, always impossible. Yet their personal indulgences continued quietly without fanfare or explanation. By the end of the month, I realized something important. It wasn't about the money at all. It was about control, about exclusion, and about shaping my perception of reality so I would accept less. That realization hurt more than anything else. Money could be earned, vacations could be saved for. But trust, once broken, left a scar that no trip could erase. Sitting in my room one evening, staring out the window at the streetlights flickering in the distance, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront her with anger, at least not yet. I would watch, observe, and prepare. I would understand the full truth before making any moves. And most importantly, I would reclaim my own sense of worth without waiting for permission or validation. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness that settled in my chest like a stone. I couldn't stop thinking about the receipts, the whispered conversations, the hidden plans. I had convinced myself to stay calm, to observe, to prepare. But that calm vanished completely when the moment of truth hit me in the most unexpected place, the airport. I was boarding a flight for my school's weekend trip, my stomach fluttering with excitement and nerves. My ticket listed seat, 22B, sandwiched between two chatty teenagers I barely knew. The fluorescent lights above the check-in counters buzzed faintly, a sound that made my heart jump with anticipation. I carried my small backpack tightly against my chest, my fingers brushing against the notebook where I had scribbled every detail from home. Then I saw them. At the entrance to the jet bridge, my mom and stepdad walked toward the first-class section. They looked different, polished, relaxed, carefree. My stomach dropped into my shoes. The leather seats gleamed. The steward greeted them with an air of familiarity, and they smiled, laughing softly as if the world belonged to them. They didn't see me at first. Or maybe they didn't care to. Time slowed. Every step they took toward those plush seats felt like a hammer to my chest. I froze mid-step, gripping my boarding pass until my knuckles whitened. First class? I whispered under my breath, barely daring to speak. All those were broke, nights, every canceled trip, every time I stayed behind. This was the truth? I felt a surge of disbelief, followed almost instantly by anger. My mind raced. How could they sit there, smiling, while I was squeezed into a tiny seat in the middle of the plane, pretending to be excited for this school trip? The injustice burned hotter than anything I had felt before. I tried to focus on my boarding, reminding myself that I had a trip of my own. But every glance toward the first-class cabin pulled me back. My mom looked up, caught my eye for a brief second, and her smile faltered. The way she turned away afterward was subtle, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. She had seen me, and yet she didn't acknowledge me. The look in her eyes said, "You weren't supposed to see this." I made my way to my seat, my hands trembling as I stuffed my bag into the overhead compartment. The hum of the engines, the chatter of students, the faint scent of jet fuel, it all blurred together as my mind replayed what I had just witnessed. I couldn't understand how someone could lie for years with such ease, how the same person who had told me we were broke could now exist in this separate, indulgent world. The moment I buckled my seatbelt, I realized I was holding my breath. I hadn't realized it until then, but the air felt tight around my lungs. My body ached, not from physical strain, but from the betrayal pressing down on me. Every lesson about sacrifice, every whispered justification about money, Every promise that we couldn't afford this or that, it all came crashing down. I tried to focus on the students around me, laughing and joking about the trip, snapping selfies and passing snacks. But my eyes kept flicking back toward the first-class cabin. I noticed the little details. The way the steward handed the menus, the silverware neatly arranged on a tray, the small plush pillows that weren't meant for me. My heart sank deeper with every detail. It wasn't just the money, I realized. It was the exclusion. It was the invisible wall that had been built between me and the world my mom had created. A world I wasn't invited to, a world where I had no place, no voice, no presence. My hands clenched in my lap as tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, stinging ache that made it hard to breathe. I tried to think of reasons, anything that could explain it. Maybe it was a special occasion I didn't know about. Maybe it was a surprise for someone else. Or maybe I was just misreading the situation. But no explanation felt right. Every excuse I could imagine felt hollow. The receipts, the whispered plans, the unacknowledged stares, they all pointed to the same conclusion. I had been deliberately left out. As the plane began taxiing, I felt a wave of nausea, not from motion, but from the weight of reality. I gripped the armrests until my knuckles ached, trying to steady my shaking hands. I could hear my mom chatting softly with my stepdad, their laughter floating faintly toward me. It sounded casual, normal, but to me, it was a cruel reminder of the truths I had been denied. The students around me started pulling out snacks and books, settling in for the flight. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus. My mind replayed every "we can't afford it" lecture, every canceled event, every disappointment I had swallowed quietly. I had accepted those explanations for years, thinking they were true. And now, in the harsh fluorescent light of first class and economy, the truth was impossible to ignore. I glanced down at my notebook in my lap. I had scribbled so much, details, observations, feelings, but I hadn't prepared for this moment. Nothing could have prepared me for seeing the reality so stark and undeniable. I wanted to scream, to confront them, to demand an explanation, but I also knew that nothing I said in that moment could fix what had been broken. I tried to distract myself, focusing on the view outside the small window by my seat. The tarmac stretched endlessly, planes taxiing, luggage carts scurrying. The smell of jet fuel and the faint whirring of engines was grounding in a way, but it couldn't erase the sting of betrayal. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass, hoping the world beyond would offer some comfort, some perspective. A classmate tapped me on the shoulder, asking a question about the itinerary. I forced a smile, nodded politely, and answered quietly, trying to keep my emotions hidden. Inside, my mind was racing. How long had this been going on? How many other experiences had been quietly reserved for them, while I was told to understand and wait my turn? The hum of the engines grew louder as we prepared for takeoff. I could feel my chest tighten with every vibration. I glanced again toward first class. My mom and stepdad settled into their seats, seemingly oblivious to the storm inside me. The steward handed them drinks with practiced ease. A small smile exchanged between them. I tried not to look, but I couldn't help it. Each gesture, each detail, felt like a personal punch. I thought about the nights I had stayed up late, imagining vacations I would never have, stories I would never hear, experiences I would never share. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, accepting the broke excuse without complaint, thinking it was part of being responsible, understanding, mature. And now I realized those sacrifices had been orchestrated, not out of necessity, but out of choice. The plane lifted into the sky, and I felt a strange mix of relief and despair. Relief that I was finally away from the physical proximity of home, but despair that the emotional distance between us had never been greater. I gripped my notebook tighter, flipping through pages I had filled with observations, memories, and reflections. Every line was a reminder of the truth I had uncovered, every word a testament to my growing awareness. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't focus on the people around me. The world outside the window, clouds stretching endlessly, sunlight glinting off distant buildings, felt both beautiful and cruel. Beautiful because it reminded me of what life could offer, cruel because it highlighted what had been taken from me. Halfway through the flight, a thought struck me, maybe this was my chance. Not to confront them immediately, not to lash out, but to observe, to understand, and to prepare. If they thought I didn't notice, I could use this clarity to my advantage. I could reclaim my sense of self, separate from the false reality they had constructed. I started taking mental notes, cataloging every subtle gesture, every exchange of glances, every hint of comfort or indulgence they allowed themselves. It felt strange, almost clinical, to analyze their behavior so objectively while my heart still ached. But I knew I needed this. I needed to understand fully, to process what I had seen before deciding my next move. As the flight continued, I tried to engage with my friends around me, forcing myself to laugh at jokes, contribute to conversations, even help organize group plans for the trip. But my attention always drifted back toward them. Every movement they made, every quiet laugh, every whispered conversation reminded me of the reality I had just discovered. By the time we began our descent, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. The image of my mom and stepdad in first class was etched into my mind, impossible to erase. Every lesson about money, responsibility, and sacrifice had been rewritten in that single devastating moment. The world I thought I knew had shifted, and I was left navigating the new reality with a mixture of anger, confusion, and resolve. When the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign clicked off, I remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the aisle leading to first class. I didn't know how I would face them, how I would process the betrayal fully, but I knew one thing: I could no longer see my mom the same way. The trust that had been the foundation of our relationship was fractured, and I would need time and careful thought to rebuild any part of it. Even as I gathered my things and joined my classmates in the crowded jetway, I felt a strange sense of empowerment creeping in. The shock, the betrayal, the raw emotion, it had all created a clarity I had never experienced before. I had seen the truth, and now I had the choice to be defined by it or to define myself in spite of it. When the plane finally landed and the chatter of the students filled the cabin, I stepped out into the airport terminal carrying more than just my small backpack. I carried a new awareness, a heavy mix of betrayal, disbelief, and a curiosity that wouldn't let go. I had seen my mom and stepdad in first class, a reality that didn't match the story I had been told for years. But seeing it wasn't enough. I needed proof, patterns, anything that could help me make sense of what had been happening behind my back. Back home, the apartment felt smaller than ever. The walls seemed to lean in with quiet judgment, as if even the furniture knew the secret I had uncovered. The scent of fried chicken from last night's dinner lingered faintly, a mundane reminder of normalcy that now felt false. I dropped my bag by the door, my eyes scanning for any sign, any clue that might corroborate what I had witnessed. The first crack appeared when I noticed a receipt on the counter, half hidden under a stack of magazines. It was from a small boutique downtown, purchased just a week prior. My mom had claimed it was just a quick errand, but the total, far beyond what I had imagined for a simple shopping trip, made my stomach twist. I picked it up carefully, running my fingers along the paper, tracing the numbers like they might explain themselves if I looked hard enough. Later that evening, while my mom was distracted preparing dinner, I took the receipts I had gathered and began lining them up on my bedroom floor. I compared them to bills I had glimpsed over the past few months: electricity, groceries, car maintenance, and patterns started to emerge. New purchases, small trips, random expenses that didn't match the "we're broke" story. Each piece of paper felt like another fragment of a larger puzzle, one I wasn't supposed to see, but couldn't ignore. As I sifted through these, memories I had pushed aside began to surface. Birthday parties that were half-hearted or entirely skipped, gifts left unopened, school events I had quietly missed, all of them tied together by the same refrain: "We can't afford it." I had swallowed these moments as reality, never questioning whether my exclusion had a different cause. But now, the inconsistencies made a painful sort of sense. I tried to act normal in the living room later that night, helping my mom clear dishes from dinner. She asked about my school trip and how my friends had behaved on the flight, her voice warm, light, the same tone she always used to create comfort. I forced a smile, describing the games we had played, the laughs we had shared. But I was careful not to mention what I had seen. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about trust, and I wasn't ready to confront it out loud. The next day, I went to my part-time job at the small cafe down the street. The hum of espresso machines, the chatter of customers, and the smell of fresh pastries usually calmed me, but today, everything felt muted. I kept replaying details in my head: the way my mom had laughed quietly with the steward, the tray of drinks handed to them without hesitation, the tiny pillows that weren't meant for me. Every sensory detail had been engraved in my mind. While wiping down tables, I noticed a tip jar left by a new employee. Coins clinked and bills rustled as customers dropped money inside. I absent-mindedly counted the small bills, realizing how carefully every dollar had been tracked at home. I remembered every lecture about budgeting, every cautionary tale about spending. And now, this meticulous frugality felt selective. The cracks weren't just in the story, they were in the very foundation of how I had been raised to believe in honesty and sacrifice. That evening, I decided to investigate further. I asked to see a copy of the electric bill under the guise of helping my mom keep track of expenses. When she handed it over, I noticed a handwritten note tucked behind the envelope. It was a reminder for a payment she had made on a credit card that I hadn't known existed. The amount was significant, not enough to be shocking, but enough to make me question her claim of financial struggle. My mind raced. How many other things had I been kept in the dark about? I started paying closer attention to the small details around the apartment. Every delivery, every package, every unexplained purchase became a potential clue. A small box arrived in the mail one afternoon, labeled with my stepdad's name. I peeked inside when he wasn't around and found a neatly folded sweater, far more expensive than anything I would have expected from him. My stomach clenched. It wasn't just the money. It was the selective enjoyment, the private pleasures I wasn't allowed to share. The cracks in the story started to appear more clearly in my daily life. I began noticing patterns I had overlooked before. How my mom always kept the budget conversation vague when I asked, how my stepdad would make small purchases while claiming they were necessary, and how they both avoided discussing their personal finances with me. These weren't just oversights, they were deliberate omissions. I tried to bring it up casually at dinner one night. "Mom, I noticed you and Dad went out last weekend. Was that planned for something special?" I asked, testing the waters. She glanced at me, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "It's none of your concern, Brianna," she said lightly, returning to her plate. Her tone wasn't sharp, but it was final. I felt a tight knot in my chest. The message was clear. Some things were off limits. Feeling frustrated, I turned to my notebook again, chronicling every incident, every small contradiction I had observed. I started writing in detail about my internal reactions, the anger, the confusion, the subtle hurt that came with realizing I had been excluded. Each page became a mirror to my growing awareness, reflecting not just the material inconsistencies, but the emotional manipulation that had been layered over years. One evening, I overheard my mom on the phone. Her voice was low, hesitant at first, then confident as she spoke about booking a weekend getaway. I held my breath, hiding behind the doorframe. The conversation wasn't about family planning or shared savings. It was clearly a personal trip for her and my stepdad. My heart sank. The realization was sharp. This exclusion wasn't temporary or accidental. It had been happening in plain sight, quietly for years. As days turned into weeks, I began noticing subtle shifts in how my parents interacted around me. The little indulgences continued. New gadgets, weekend dinners, spontaneous purchases, but they never extended to me. I started comparing my life to theirs in a way I hadn't before, noting the contrasts in what was deemed essential versus what was luxury only for them. It wasn't about jealousy anymore. It was about clarity. I had finally seen the structure of the hidden hierarchy at home. I also reflected on my own reactions. The quiet resignation I had adopted for so long now felt like a trap. I realized that the patience and understanding I thought were virtues had been manipulated. My compliance had made it easier for them to indulge privately, leaving me behind. The cracks weren't just in their story. They were in the narrative I had built about my role in the family, the version of myself that had always accepted less. To cope, I began documenting not only financial inconsistencies, but emotional ones. I noted the moments of exclusion, how my mom would announce trips casually, knowing I couldn't attend, how my stepdad would plan things during my free time without consulting me, how small celebrations would include friends or coworkers, but never me. Each observation made the picture clearer, sharper, and more painful. One quiet afternoon, I decided to confront a different kind of evidence, my personal memories. I went through old photographs, journals from school, and scrapbooks my mom had kept. Patterns emerged. My birthdays were often understated or forgotten, while small celebrations for others were highlighted. School trips I had begged to attend were always too expensive, yet family friends documented vacations I wasn't invited to. The emotional betrayal intertwined with the financial inconsistencies to form a mosaic of exclusion I couldn't ignore. I remember one particularly striking evening. I was flipping through a photo album my mom had left on the couch. A family friend's vacation pictures were tucked neatly beside it, dated the same month I had been told we couldn't afford my own trip. I could see the smiles, the laughter, the careful framing of moments I had been denied. I felt a wave of anger I couldn't contain. I slammed the album shut, my hands shaking, but underneath the anger was something else, a growing sense of resolve. The more I investigated, the more subtle the cracks became, each one a testament to a larger truth. I started noticing how small gestures, like the way they talked about savings or spending, were designed to keep me in a certain mindset. I had internalized the "we're broke" narrative for so long that the world outside my observations seemed impossible. Now, seeing the reality, I understood how carefully the story had been curated. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control, about shaping perception, about deciding which truths I was allowed to know. I began feeling a quiet anger that was different from the sudden shock of seeing them in first class. This anger was slower, deeper, and more deliberate. It fueled my curiosity and my need for understanding. I knew that this story, the cracks in the truth, was mine to piece together, and I was determined to do it carefully without letting my emotions push me into rash actions. By the end of the week, I had constructed a small timeline. Every small expense, every private indulgence, every canceled plan for me aligned neatly with the bigger picture I had started to see. My mom's and stepdad's lives, separate from mine, had always existed parallel to the world I thought I shared with them. And now that I had seen it clearly, there was no going back. I couldn't unsee it, couldn't unknow it, and couldn't ignore it. The air in my room felt heavy that night, almost suffocating. I had spent the evening flipping through receipts, journal entries, and memories, piecing together the reality of what had been happening behind my back. I didn't want to confront my mom, yet, not in anger, but I couldn't continue pretending anymore. The truth had to be acknowledged. I couldn't carry this weight silently any longer. I waited for the right moment. The apartment was quiet. My stepdad was watching a late-night show in the living room, the flickering light from the TV casting strange shadows on the walls. My mom was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the soft blue glow. I took a deep breath, feeling my chest tighten. Every step I took toward the kitchen made my heart pound harder. "Mom," I said, my voice steady but soft, "can we talk?" She looked up, her eyes briefly clouded with surprise, but quickly softened into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Brianna. What's on your mind?" she said, her tone light, almost casual, as if she expected this to be a trivial conversation. I pulled out the notebook I had been keeping for weeks, placing it gently on the table. "I've been noticing things, little things that don't add up." I began, trying to keep my voice calm. "The receipts, the trips, the packages. I've seen a pattern, Mom. I need to understand why I've been kept out of certain things, why I was told we couldn't afford things when the reality seems different." Her smile faltered, and she glanced at the notebook, the edges trembling slightly as if she recognized the gravity of what I had compiled. She set her phone aside and leaned back in her chair. "Brianna, I think you're reading too much into things," she said, her voice calm, measured. "Sometimes adults have to make decisions you won't understand yet. It's not about keeping you out. It's about doing what's best for the family." I felt a lump form in my throat. Doing what's best. "Mom, we've been told we're broke for years. Trips, birthdays, little things I asked for, they were always too expensive. And yet I see receipts, I see packages, I see first-class tickets that weren't for me. How is that doing what's best?" She shook her head slightly, her fingers nervously tapping on the table. "Brianna, there are things you don't see, things adults deal with. I never meant to hurt you. I wanted to handle some things on my own without burdening you. That's all." Her words felt hollow. I wanted to believe her. I really did, but the clarity I had gathered over weeks of observation told me otherwise. "Mom, I'm not asking to manage your finances," I said, my voice firmer now. "I'm asking for honesty, for trust. I'm asking to be included in the family, not excluded by stories that aren't true." She let out a soft sigh and looked down at her hands. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the background, filling the silence between us. I could feel the tension in the air, a taut thread ready to snap. I thought I was protecting you, Brianna," she murmured. "I didn't know how else to do it. I wanted you to appreciate what we have, to learn responsibility. I never realized how much it would hurt you." I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Protecting me? Mom, I feel like I've been manipulated. Not cared for, not protected, manipulated. I've trusted you my whole life, and now I don't know what to believe." She flinched at my words, her eyes glistening slightly. "Brianna, please understand. I wasn't thinking about it that way. I didn't want you to feel entitled. I wanted you to learn to value what you have. That's all." Her explanation fell flat. It didn't erase the years of missed experiences, the repeated lies, the first-class reality I had witnessed. I wanted to scream, to accuse, to make her feel the sting of the betrayal I had carried quietly for so long, but I held back. Anger burned inside me, a slow, steady fire that I could feel in my chest, down to my fingertips. Instead, I decided on silence. I would not let this conversation become a battlefield. I wanted honesty, not performance. Mom, I need some space. I said finally. I need to process all of this on my own. I can't. I can't pretend everything is normal right now. Her face fell, a mixture of hurt and confusion flashing across her features. Space. Brianna, I just wanted to explain. I know, I interrupted gently but firmly, and I appreciate that. But I need distance. I need to figure out how to trust again. I can't do that while we're still acting like nothing happened. She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the table. If that's what you need. I understand, she said quietly. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but I could feel the tension lingering, unspoken emotions hovering in the air like thick fog. For the next few days, I withdrew further. I spent more time in my room, flipping through my notebook, reflecting on every interaction, every inconsistency I had observed. Each page, each entry became a reminder, not just a betrayal, but also of my growing clarity. I realized that distance wasn't just about physical space. It was about reclaiming my sense of self, about protecting my emotions while I processed what had been done to me. Even at school, I felt different. I noticed how other students shared stories about their parents, their vacations, their family traditions. I listened politely, smiled when necessary, but I didn't share much about my own experiences anymore. It wasn't about shame. It was about understanding that the family I had thought I knew had fractures I hadn't seen before. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. Leaves rustled underfoot, and the distant sound of children playing reached me faintly from a nearby park. The air was crisp, carrying a scent of autumn leaves and faint gasoline from passing cars. Walking, I let my mind wander over every detail I had gathered, the receipts, the conversations, the patterns of exclusion. I realized that confrontation had changed me. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about observation, understanding, and preparation. I had learned that anger could be quiet and deliberate. I didn't need to lash out to assert myself. I needed clarity, perspective, and self-preservation. At home, the distance between us was palpable. I noticed how my mom adjusted her behavior around me, speaking more cautiously, avoiding certain topics, keeping gestures small and measured. I could feel the strain in the air, the invisible line I had drawn, the space that allowed me to breathe and think. She tried to engage me in conversation a few times, but I politely excused myself, retreating to the quiet of my room. During one of these evenings, I sat by the window, notebook in lap, watching the streetlights flicker in the dark. I reflected on the confrontation, the words exchanged, the silences, the subtle shifts in body language. I realized that distance wasn't just emotional protection, it was a tool for understanding. By stepping back, I could analyze the cracks without interference, and perhaps someday confront them fully with knowledge rather than just emotion. I also noticed small patterns in their reactions. When I didn't respond immediately to invitations or questions, my mom would hesitate, glance toward my room, and then carry on. The tension was subtle but consistent. It was almost as if she was testing me, trying to measure my distance and my resolve. I felt a strange satisfaction in knowing I wasn't reacting impulsively. I had control now. Days turned into a week, and the emotional distance I maintained started to give me a sense of clarity. I could see my parents more objectively, without the blind trust one had once carried. I observed their actions, their patterns, and the small indulgences they allowed themselves. Each observation added another layer of understanding, reinforcing the reality I had piece together. During a particularly quiet evening, I overheard my stepdad laughing softly over the phone. The sound, which might have been ordinary before, now felt like a reminder of the separation between my parents and me. I didn't feel jealousy. I felt awareness. I was noticing, recording, understanding. And I realized that awareness was my power. By the end of the second week, I had developed a rhythm. Space in the apartment, observation from my room, careful reflection, and detailed notes. I wasn't hiding or ignoring the situation. I was engaging with it on my terms. Confrontation had taught me that emotional distance didn't mean disconnection. It meant clarity. It meant reclaiming agency over my feelings and my reactions. The cracks in the story were still there, visible and undeniable. But now, with distance, I could navigate them. I could choose when to engage, when to question, and when to observe. I wasn't a passive participant in the narrative anymore. I was an active observer, ready to decide how I wanted to move forward. The days following my decision to create distance were oddly liberating. For the first time, I wasn't trying to please anyone. I wasn't trying to make sense of their justifications or soften my disappointment. I was simply observing, recording, and most importantly, planning. Not planning to lash out, but planning to reclaim my life piece by piece, quietly, without their interference. I started small, with personal routines that had always been interrupted or overlooked. I began waking early, taking long walks through the neighborhood, noticing the familiar streets as if seeing them for the first time. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves mixed with the aroma of bakery bread from a nearby shop. I noticed details I'd always ignored, the way sunlight glinted on windows, the rhythm of cars on the pavement, the distant laughter of children playing. Every step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been buried beneath years of compliance. At school, I became more attentive, not to my parents' secrets this time, but to myself. I started excelling in small ways, quietly achieving things without needing recognition from anyone at home. A teacher praised my project on American history. Another complimented my essay on environmental change. I smiled politely, nodding, but inside, each acknowledgement was a small victory. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about proving to myself that I mattered, that my worth wasn't dictated by the selective indulgences of my parents. The quiet revenge began with subtle actions. I started saving money from my part-time job, meticulously, keeping it in a small envelope hidden in my room. Every dollar I earned felt like a stake in my independence, a small rebellion against the narrative that I could never afford anything. I didn't boast. I didn't flaunt. I simply built something tangible for myself, quietly, without their knowledge. I also started paying attention to their patterns, not out of obsession, but out of strategic awareness. I noticed how my mom tended to overbook weekends with dinners or errands, leaving her distracted and unavailable. I began choosing those moments for my own activities, volunteer work, personal projects, or even just long walks that were entirely mine. Each small choice was an assertion of autonomy, a way of reclaiming my time and energy without confrontation. One evening, I overheard my stepdad making plans over the phone, a last-minute weekend getaway with my mom. Normally, this would have provoked anger or resentment, but instead, I felt something unexpected, clarity. I realized I didn't need to participate or protest. I had my own plans. I had my own life. I could step into the world with confidence, while they remained oblivious to the quiet strength I was cultivating. I also explored my creativity, something I had neglected while trying to navigate their expectations. I started keeping a journal beyond observations, filling pages with stories, sketches, and reflections. Writing became a sanctuary, a place where I could process emotions fully without restraint. Each page was a reminder of my resilience, a testament that I could create, observe, and exist without waiting for validation from those who had misled me. Another form of quiet revenge manifested in subtle independence at home. I stopped volunteering for every household task automatically. I still helped when necessary, but I learned to set boundaries, turning down requests that drained me unnecessarily or claiming my personal space without apology. Each refusal was deliberate, measured, a small assertion that I wasn't bound to their priorities. I also began investing in my own experiences. A few small purchases, books I had longed for, a camera to capture my walks, a journal with thick pages, were discreet but meaningful. They weren't extravagant, but each one represented my agency, my decision to claim enjoyment and growth on my own terms. For the first time, I realized that joy didn't have to be granted by others. It could be self-created. At the same time, I observed my parents in a different light. Their patterns, once so hidden, were now clear to me. I noticed the small indulgences, the late-night desserts, the boutique packages, the whispered plans, and I no longer felt stingy envy. Instead, I felt an odd sense of amusement. They were acting as they always had, unaware that their careful curation of a world separate from me no longer held power over my perception. One day, while walking through the park, I met a group of local teenagers working on a community project, planting trees along the sidewalk. They invited me to help, and I agreed without hesitation. The physical labor, the fresh air, and the sense of contributing to something bigger than myself was intoxicating. For hours, I focused entirely on the task, feeling energy and purpose surge through me. That evening, covered in dirt and sweat, I felt a satisfaction I had never associated with my home life. It was quiet, understated, but deeply fulfilling, a revenge of sorts, showing that my happiness didn't require their participation or approval. I began noticing changes in myself. I walked taller, spoke with more confidence, and laughed more freely. My eyes, once cautious and wary, now carried a quiet determination. I didn't need to confront them aggressively to assert myself. I simply existed fully, deliberately, independently. The quiet revenge was in living well without them, in proving to myself that my world wasn't limited to the selective reality they had created. At home, the tension remained, but it no longer dictated my actions. I noticed my mom glancing toward me occasionally, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. My stepdad paused in conversations when I entered the room, but instead of confrontation, I chose observation and calm. Their subtle attempts to assert normalcy no longer intimidated me. I was aware, prepared, and detached enough to maintain control over my own responses. One evening, I decided to try something new, a solo project I had postponed for months. I gathered materials for a photography portfolio, intending to capture the subtle beauty of everyday life, the sunlight spilling through windows, the reflections on puddles after rain, the expressions of strangers at the bus stop. As I clicked the shutter repeatedly, I realized how much I had neglected noticing the world around me while preoccupied with family dynamics. Each photo felt like a reclamation of perspective, a quiet declaration that my vision mattered. The more I invested in myself, the more empowered I felt. I started participating in small competitions at school, entering writing contests and photography showcases. I didn't tell anyone at home. I didn't need to. Each success, no matter how minor, reinforced my independence and my growing identity outside of the family story I had been given. I also learned to navigate emotional boundaries. When my mom or stepdad attempted to draw me into conversations about finances, trips, or family obligations, I responded politely but firmly, maintaining the space I had carved for myself. I no longer felt guilty or defensive. The quiet revenge was subtle but pervasive, It wasn't about confrontation, it was about establishing equilibrium, where their actions no longer dictated my emotions or my decisions. During this period, I noticed subtle, almost imperceptible changes in my parents' behavior. They seemed more cautious, as if aware that I was observing closely, that I had grown beyond the limitations they had set. I didn't provoke these reactions. I simply existed fully, engaged in my own life. Their uncertainty was a reflection of the shift in power, not through anger or rebellion, but through deliberate self-determination. In my solitude, I reflected on what this journey had taught me. Betrayal, exclusion, and dishonesty had hurt deeply, but they also became catalysts for growth. I discovered resilience I hadn't recognized, independence I hadn't cultivated, and a sense of self that wasn't contingent on anyone else's narrative. The quiet revenge wasn't about revenge at all. It was about reclaiming my story, living authentically, and cultivating fulfillment from within. I began to take small trips on my own, local day trips I planned carefully with the money I had saved from my job. I visited museums, walked city streets I had always admired from afar, and explored parks and neighborhoods with a new perspective. These excursions weren't extravagant, they were intentional. Each one reinforced my autonomy and reminded me that experiences weren't determined by others, they were determined by my choices. Over time, I noticed my own confidence manifest in unexpected ways. Friends came to me for advice, teachers sought my input, and I felt a sense of agency in daily life I had never experienced before. I didn't need to confront my parents for acknowledgement. I didn't need to demand fairness. My quiet revenge was the life I was building step by deliberate step, independent of their influence. One quiet evening, I sat on the balcony, journal in hand, reflecting on the journey. The city lights flickered in the distance, cars passing with distant hums, a gentle breeze ruffling the pages of my notebook. I realized that self-discovery had become my most powerful tool. I had turned betrayal into motivation, exclusion into awareness, and deception into clarity. The quiet revenge wasn't about hurting them, it was about nurturing myself quietly, deliberately, and unapologetically. By the time I closed my journal, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. The fractures in my family's narrative remained, but they no longer dictated my emotions or my path. I had discovered that empowerment didn't require confrontation, that happiness didn't require validation, and that my worth wasn't contingent on selective indulgence or exclusion. The quiet revenge had worked, not through anger or exposure, but through the cultivation of self-respect, independence, and deliberate growth. I had learned to observe without judgment, act without provocation, and thrive despite the fractures I had uncovered. Most importantly, I had learned to trust myself, to recognize my own value, and to live fully, even when the people I loved most had misled me. Sitting on my balcony that night, the city lights shimmering below like a scattering of tiny stars, I finally let myself breathe. For so long, I had carried the weight of disappointment, the heaviness of exclusion, and the sting of a truth I wasn't supposed to see. Every canceled trip, every "we're broke" excuse, every subtle gesture that told me I didn't belong had been a scar etched into my memory. And yet, as I looked out over the quiet hum of streets and the distant glow of headlights, I realized that those scars didn't define me, they had shaped me. They had forced me to see the world and myself with unflinching clarity. I understood now that the betrayal wasn't about the money or the trips or even the first-class seats my parents had so casually enjoyed. It was about control, about stories told to keep me in a certain place, about decisions made in shadows, while I pretended to accept them as truth. And I also understood that I had a choice to be defined by that manipulation or to reclaim my own narrative. I chose the latter. My quiet revenge wasn't about confrontation or shouting, nor was it about proving them wrong in some spectacular way. It was about building a life that they couldn't influence or diminish. Each small step, saving money for myself, pursuing hobbies, exploring new places, observing without judgment, setting boundaries, was a brick in the foundation of my independence. Each act reminded me that I was capable of happiness on my own terms, that my worth wasn't tied to the selective indulgences I had once been denied, and that my voice, my choices, and my experiences mattered just as much as anyone else's. I discovered a strength I didn't know I had, a quiet confidence that didn't need validation from my parents or anyone else. I realized that the most powerful form of revenge is not anger, not exposure, but living fully, unapologetically, and with integrity. As I reflected on everything, the shock of first-class seats, the inconsistencies I had uncovered, the conversations, the silences, and the emotional distance I had maintained, I felt a sense of closure. Not because the past was erased, but because I had learned to carry it without letting it weigh me down. I had learned to observe without bitterness, to act without resentment, and to thrive without dependency. I had discovered that self-respect is more valuable than approval, and that true courage is often quiet, deliberate, and internal. Sitting there in the gentle night breeze, I smiled softly to myself. The cracks in my family's story remained, but they no longer controlled me. I had reclaimed my life piece by piece, and in doing so, I had found something even more precious, myself, and in that quiet triumph, I realized something profound. Life would always have betrayals, disappointments, and hidden truths. But those things didn't have to break me. They could teach me, strengthen me, and guide me toward the version of myself I was always capable of becoming. I leaned back, letting the cool air brush across my skin, feeling an unexpected lightness in my chest. For the first time in years, I felt free, not just from the lies of my parents, but from the fear and uncertainty that had lived inside me for so long. I had discovered the quiet, unshakable power of independence, resilience, and self-love, and that knowledge would carry me further than any first-class ticket ever could.